Hello. This is the second part of me reading you my favorite memoir, I guess. I should probably just rename these videos. Reading you my favorite memoir. This is chapter 2 of Without You There Is No Us by Suki Kim. For a place shrouded in rumors of violence, Pyongyang always appears surprisingly gentle, at least at first. This visit, my fourth, was no different. The horizon was empty except for a handful of old airplanes perched on the tarmac like ancient flies. The surrounding farmland looked as though it belonged in a story about some place where nothing bad ever happened, and the villagers meant you no harm. Against the stark stillness stood a lone airport terminal, topped with a giant portrait of Kim Il-sung. In the distance, a group of huddled men waited to guide each delegation. Whenever I come upon the tattered phrase, deafening silence, I recall that initial impression, that quiet wonder upon finally beholding the object of so much fascination, finding that this modern-day Atlantis, or anti-Atlantis, really exists after all. You want an explanation, an apology, some clarity. Yet there it is, just a tiny airport on the outskirts of a capital city, nothing more or less. The silence is strange, since wherever else you are in Pyongyang, your senses are never left in peace. Inevitably, music blasts from a speaker nearby. Sometimes it is a love song, sometimes a marching tune. But the topic is always the same. Virtually every building is adorned with a slogan. Every TV screen with the same image, the way advertising billboards fill the horizon in Western societies. But in North Korea, there is only one product, the great leader. Yet beneath such noise is terrifying silence. Everything has been so hushed for decades that if you press your ear to the stillness, you can almost hear the muted cries. The customs official took my American passport, glanced at it, and asked if I spoke Korean. The North Koreans I had met in the past always seemed proud to be Korean. Despite the war between us that had loomed more than half a century, when Koreans find themselves around Westerners, it is always us against them. When I answered him in Korean, he smiled and let me pass. Immediately, we had to give up our passports and cell phones to the minder who was waiting for us. The small airport looked a lot brighter than I remembered, and the baggage carousels were actually moving this time. The first time I flew into Pyongyang in 2002, soon after the famine, bags had simply been thrown on the floor, and the bathroom was a pitch-dark hole with no toilet paper. My fellow teachers and I followed the minder to a bus that had been sent by POST. About 10 minutes beyond downtown Pyongyang, after crossing Cheongsong Loyalty Bridge and the Taedong River, we took an exit onto a narrow road with farmland on either side. This led to a gate bearing the school's name, with a tiny gatehouse on its left, beyond which the campus came into view. The place was so secluded that it might have been a sanitarium. There was a lot of concrete, and the dull heaviness of the buildings imbued the place with a sense of forlorn. To the left was a slim, tall stone monument that reached higher than the nearby 5-story building, topped with massive letters spelling out, "Long live General Kim Jong-il, the son of the 21st century." The building contained classrooms, and it was connected by an enclosed walkway to the cafeteria building, which was connected to a health clinic and bathhouse, which were in turn connected to the dormitories, so that the buildings and walkway formed a sort of horseshoe. The walkways had windows on either side, and it struck me that there was no privacy here, that anyone's movements were visible. The only structure not connected to the rest was an austere gray building to our right, which stood on its own. It would not be true to say that a sense of dread came over me the first time I beheld the set of buildings in that isolated compound that was soon to be my refuge and prison. I simply felt nothing, much the way I felt nothing the first time I saw New York at the age of 13. That first glimpse comes with no history, no warning. The school was just a school. The students whose faces would fill that 248-acre space with meaning, for me, were still nowhere to be seen. Instead, I was preoccupied with the logistics of the place. Who approved it and why, and who was here both to teach and to be taught? The next morning, my alarm went off at 5 a.m., and for a moment I was lost. This happens in any new city, but when that city is Pyongyang, it takes an extra moment to get your bearings. The teachers' dormitories were made up of cookie-cutter, modern, two-bedroom apartments, each about 500 square feet. From the entrance, there were 2 rooms to the right, both with queen-sized beds, an open kitchen with a dining table, a small living area with a leather couch, a TV, an inter-campus phone, almost floor-to-ceiling windows, and a modern bathroom. I had mine all to myself, and it was nicer than almost any dorm I had lived in. The first thing I saw when I looked out my 5th floor window was a plain green stretch of land and 2 buildings just beyond the campus. One of the buildings was a drab yellow, with a blue roof, and looked a bit like a New England-style barn. The other was a concrete building barricaded by a stone wall. During my entire stay, I would never find out what they were, as I learned not to ask many questions. Fighting off pangs of loneliness and fear, I got up and switched on the kettle, which I had bought in Beijing, and looked for coffee in my suitcase. Over there, coffee will feel like currency, someone had told me, and this was true. I am not loyal to any brand, but in my dormitory at PUST, my breakfast blend coffee from Trader Joe's felt like a true luxury, and the mark of capitalism, a reminder of the outside world. I had added a few drops of the long-lasting milk I had brought with me, which had a pungent, synthetic taste I would never get used to. So I stood there with my first morning coffee in Pyongyang, looking out at the bleak, unknowable buildings. I felt as far away from everything I knew as if I had been erased overnight. I had been told that breakfast was between 6:30 and 7:30 in the cafeteria, and when I stepped outside, I could see the cylindrical stone monument towering into the sky in the distance. On either side of the path were tiny orange and pink flowers that looked as generic as the buildings. I saw no one and slowly walked towards the cafeteria, passing 3 identical-looking student dormitories on my right. The walk took about 5 minutes, and I would do this 3 times a day for a month for that summer semester, and more in the fall, although I did not know then that I would be able to last that long. On my way, I saw the Pyongyang skyline, so hazy that I could barely make it out, and on the horizon was a lone smokestack belching thin, occasional smoke, the only sign of life in that still landscape. It was the kind of cafeteria you might see anywhere. Past the heavy glass doors was a huge hall packed with tables. There was a self-service food station where students and teachers lined up separately. Breakfast was porridge and boiled eggs. I took a metal tray and was beginning to help myself when I heard my name being shouted from one of the tables. "Hello, how nice we meet again," said a man brightly. From his accent, I could tell that he was North Korean. Who could I possibly bump into here? I took a deep breath and turned around, facing a round, tanned face and smiling eyes. They all have smiling eyes, the Minders, but Mr. Rhee stood out. During the New York Philharmonic coverage in 2008, he had been assigned to the foreign journalists, although he had shadowed me most of the time as I was the sole Korean-speaking journalist among them, and was thus seen as more of a threat. He had been particularly friendly, and had spoken to me in casual Korean, talking about his wife, for whom he was trying to quit smoking. The men I had met there in the past liked cigarettes. American cigarettes in particular were a novelty. They would swear that the United States was their number one enemy, and yet carrying a pack of Marlboro Lights seemed to be a sign of privilege and class. Visitors to North Korea often bring cigarettes and whiskey for their Minders as a kind of hedge against their eternal watchfulness. I had brought a few cartons on that trip too, and when I gave them out, whoever was on the receiving end inevitably asked if they were purchased in China or America. They said that there were many fake Marlboro Lights in China. On the Philharmonic trip, Mr. Rhee and I had chatted so effortlessly at times that it was confusing to make sense of our relationship, since his job was to report on me, and my job as a magazine correspondent reporting on the event was not all that different. It is remarkable how quickly camaraderie develops when tensions are high. The 36 hours in Pyongyang on that trip were a whirlwind. It turned out that was the whole point. It was a PR event carefully orchestrated by the DPRK regime, with the American orchestra providing the incidental music. There was nothing any of us could write about except what we were allowed to see, which was a concert like any other, a few staged welcome performances, and the usual tourist sites. It was a lesson in control and manipulation. The real audience was not those in the concert hall, but the journalists whose role was to deliver a sanitized version of North Korea to the outside world. And what shocked me was how easily seduced they were. Both CNN and the New York Times reported that the performance drew tears from the audience, and soon the major newspapers around the world followed with stories about the successful experiment in cultural diplomacy. Lauren Mazel, the conductor of the Philharmonic, declared that 70 million Koreans would thank him forever. I witnessed no crying in the audience, all hand-picked members of the party elite, nor did any of the correspondents I spoke to after the performance. The tears I recall from that trip were of a different kind. Although it was my second time visiting North Korea, I burst into tears while saying goodbye to my Minder. I was not a journalist on assignment in that moment. Instead, I was thinking of my grandmother and my uncle and my great-aunt and her daughters and the millions of Korean lives erased and forgotten. Right there on the tarmac, before boarding the chartered flight with everyone in our mission, I told Mr. Rhee that I was sick of this division and that I would probably never see him again because the people of his country were not allowed to leave or even have contact with the rest of the world. That his country was so isolated that even I, a fellow Korean, could only visit as part of the American delegation, shadowing the American orchestra, and that it broke my heart to see how bad things really were there. I said all of this standing on that tarmac, my face covered with tears. The floodgates opened after 36 hours of enforced silence. This, in hindsight, was thoughtless of me. I was about to climb onto that flight and return to the free world, but he was stuck there, and the other Minders saw this encounter. But surprisingly, tears ran down his face too, along with the faces of 2 other minders nearby. They said nothing, just cried and cried. My first reaction to seeing Mr. Rhee here 3 years later was that of relief. He had not been punished for crying with me at the airport. He was okay. And then I felt afraid. He had met me as a journalist, so what would he make of the fact that I stood before him as a missionary teacher? It was a mystery to me why I had been allowed in. Joan and President Kim knew that I was a writer, although they thought of me as a novelist, which they must have not considered a threat. But they had only to Google me to find out that I had in fact published a fair number of articles and op-eds about North Korea. The most recent piece had been a feature essay on defecation, a taboo topic, but President Kim had also been very interested in the Fulbright organization, which had given me a fellowship, and asked me to arrange a meeting between him and the Seoul Division's director, which I did. And I had been referred to him by the powerful Mrs. Gund. Whatever the reason, I had passed their vetting. Mr. Rhee called me over to join him where he was sitting with another man. He looked genuinely happy to see me again, and I also gave him a bright hello. "How have you been? What brought you here?" he asked. I played along. "Oh, life. I've been teaching since I last met you, first in America, then in Seoul, now Pyongyang." This was mostly true. I taught creative writing. He seemed satisfied with this answer and urged me to eat. The cloudy porridge, or watery boiled rice, tasted like it looked. If Mr. Rhee recalled our tears from 3 years ago, he said nothing. To ease the moment, I acted jolly. The minders like to talk in circles, to tease and to be teased. "Do I look older?" I asked him. "I guess you can see the full-blown old maid in me now." "No, still fine, barely fine, just hanging in there," he said. We both laughed, but it felt hollow and did nothing to dispel my feelings of paranoia. This seemed to be the staff area. Nearby, a group of about 30 young women in khaki army uniforms sat hunched over their metal trays. Mr. Rhee explained that they were the guards to keep us safe. It was hard to believe that these women in their early 20s had been sent to stand guard at PUST, where the students were all male. I felt protective of them, so far from home, so vulnerable, so outnumbered by men. Who were they guarding, the teachers or the students? Or were they more like prison guards, there to make sure we did not escape? For the entire time I was there, I would see them patrolling the campus. I tried to speak to them a few times, but they never replied. From outside the cafeteria, I heard the sound of a marching song, hollered in unison, and as soon as it ended, dozens of young men poured in. Then more came in, and more, until the cafeteria filled with hundreds of them. They were in their late teens and early 20s, dressed in white or blue dress shirts, black pants, and ties. My first impression was that they looked like an army. The armistice agreement had been signed more than half a century ago, and the rest of the world had moved on. Even most South Koreans have moved on. Although there's a mandatory military service for all men there, they do not live in a constant state of threat. Here, however, it was as though someone had put his giant thumb on the pause button in 1953, and even the students were ready for battle. Once inside, they quickly gathered their metal spoons and chopsticks and took seats at tables for 4. I knew that I was allowed to sit with them from the next day on, and the thought of getting to know young North Koreans made me feel more hopeful about my time there. When I asked one of the teachers how they would feel about sitting with me, she said that there would not be any problem. They were all eager to practice their English. Already I could see that they were just as curious about me. Some stared throughout their meal. When I tried returning their gaze, however, they quickly looked away. So that was chapter 2 of Without You, There Is No Us. And chapter 3 is pretty long. It's like 19 pages. So I'm going to save that for a separate video. And hopefully some of you are following along and getting into it. I think in the next chapters where things start to get really broken down about their environment and some of the very interesting ways of life in North Korea. So that's all for this one. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.